Before anyone believed in him, they laughed. When he inherited a forgotten house deep in the American South, it seemed like a curse rather than a gift. But hidden beneath its decaying walls was a secret that would change everything. This is a story about an abandoned mansion, a buried legacy, and the moment when the past finally demands to be remembered. Daniel Rhodes had learned to measure time in overdue notices and muted phone calls. The days no longer broke cleanly into mornings and evenings, but blurred together in a slow procession of obligations he could barely keep up with. His apartment on the outskirts of Memphis was small enough that every sound carried: the hum of the refrigerator, the rattle of the air conditioner that struggled against southern humidity, the faint traffic noise drifting in through thin windows. It was the kind of place meant to be temporary, yet it had held him longer than he'd like to admit. Since the divorce, life had narrowed. Bills arrived with relentless precision, while work came sporadically. Daniel picked up whatever he could find: warehouse shifts, short-term repair jobs, delivery routes that paid just enough to make refusing them impossible. The uncertainty wore on him, but worse was the quiet distance that had settled between him and his children. Lauren, nearly grown, moved through the apartment like a guest rather than a daughter, her thoughts guarded and her patience thin. Toby, still young enough to accept the world as it presented itself, stayed close, sensing more than he understood. Daniel often caught himself watching them from across the room, struck by the awareness that he was failing in ways no paycheck could measure. He had promised stability once. He had promised answers. What he delivered instead were reassurances that grew less convincing each time he spoke them. The letter arrived on a Thursday afternoon, folded neatly among utility bills and advertising flyers. At first glance, it looked official in a way that made his stomach tighten. The return address belonged to a county office in rural Mississippi, a place Daniel had not thought about in decades, if ever. He almost set it aside, assuming it was some bureaucratic error, but something about the weight of the envelope made him pause. Inside was a single sheet of formal language, typed and precise, informing him that a distant relative had passed away without immediate heirs. The name stopped him cold. It belonged to a man his family rarely mentioned, a name that surfaced only in half-finished stories or was dismissed with vague remarks about old grudges and bad choices. According to the letter, Daniel was the closest living kin and therefore the legal beneficiary of the estate. The estate, however, was not what most people imagined when they heard the word inheritance. There was no mention of money, investments, or valuables. Instead, the letter described a property, a large residential structure built in the mid-19th century, located deep in a rural county bordered by wetlands and forest. The house was officially condemned, listed as structurally unsound, and scheduled for potential demolition pending ownership resolution. Enclosed was a key ring with several rusted keys and a copy of a property tax record showing years of unpaid fees. Daniel read the letter twice, then a third time, as if the meaning might shift with repetition. The name of the town meant nothing to him. The address was little more than a road designation followed by a mile marker. It sounded less like a destination than a warning. His first reaction was disbelief, followed quickly by a bitter laugh. Of course, this would be the kind of inheritance that found him, a problem disguised as an opportunity, arriving at a moment when he had no margin for either. He imagined explaining it to friends, to his ex-wife, to anyone who might ask. A condemned house in the middle of nowhere, passed down like an unwanted burden. He folded the letter carefully and set it on the counter, intending to forget it. But he did not. That evening, as Lauren sat scrolling through her phone and Toby built a crooked tower out of mismatched blocks, Daniel found his attention drifting back to the letter. The image of the property, though described only in dry legal terms, had begun to take shape in his mind. He imagined wide porches sagging with age, rooms sealed off by dust and neglect, a place abandoned not just physically but by memory itself. He told himself it was foolish to consider it. The cost of travel alone would strain him, not to mention whatever obligations came with claiming the property. And yet beneath the practical objections, there was something else, a quiet pull he could not quite name. Perhaps it was desperation, perhaps curiosity, or perhaps it was the sense that his life had narrowed so much that even an unwanted inheritance felt like a door left slightly ajar. He waited 2 days before making a decision, during which the letter never left his thoughts. By Sunday morning, he was studying maps online, tracing a route that led south through small towns and thinning cell service. The drive would be long, but manageable. He would need to take time off, such as it was. He would need to bring the kids. There was no one else. When he finally said the words aloud, they sounded unreal even to him. They were going to Mississippi, just to look, just to see what it was. Lauren did not bother hiding her skepticism. She listened with folded arms, her expression a careful balance of disbelief and restrained irritation. Toby, on the other hand, reacted with wide-eyed interest, asking questions about old houses and whether they would see animals along the way. Daniel answered as best he could, careful not to promise anything he could not deliver. He framed the trip as temporary, a short detour to settle unfinished business. Packing was minimal: clothes, snacks, a cooler, a flashlight or two. Daniel tucked the envelope with the letter and keys into his bag, unsure why he felt the need to keep it close. Early Monday morning, they loaded into the car and pulled onto the highway, leaving behind the familiar sprawl of Memphis for roads that grew quieter with each passing mile. As the city faded in the rearview mirror, Daniel felt a mixture of relief and unease. The farther they traveled, the more the landscape changed. Gas stations became scarce. Cell service flickered and vanished. The air seemed heavier somehow, carrying the scent of damp earth and vegetation, even through closed windows. By the time they crossed into Mississippi, the sky had taken on a muted quality, clouded without threatening rain. Daniel followed handwritten directions, printed from an outdated map service, guiding them off main highways and onto narrower roads. The farther they went, the less certain he felt of where they were. The world outside the windshield narrowed to trees and stretches of unmarked land. He tried to recall anything his family had ever said about the relative whose name was printed on the letter. There were fragments, nothing more. Mentions of a house that should have been sold long ago. Stories cut short. Warnings delivered without explanation. As a child, Daniel had accepted these silences without question. As an adult, he felt their weight more keenly. They turned onto a road that barely qualified as such, flanked by tall trees draped with hanging moss. The pavement gave way to gravel, then to packed dirt. Daniel slowed the car, gripping the steering wheel more tightly. He checked the address again, comparing it to the mile markers that appeared infrequently, as if unsure whether they wanted to be found. When the house finally emerged from the trees, Daniel felt his breath catch. It was larger than he had imagined, rising out of the landscape with a presence that felt almost defiant. Time had not been kind to it. The structure leaned slightly, its wood darkened and worn. Shutters hung crookedly. Vines crawled up the sides, reclaiming what neglect had surrendered. He brought the car to a stop and turned off the engine. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence pressed in, broken only by distant insects and the faint rustle of leaves. Daniel stared at the house, aware that this was no longer an abstract problem or a line of text on a legal document. It was real, solid, and waiting. He did not yet know why, but standing there at the edge of that overgrown property, Daniel felt certain of one thing. Whatever had been left to him here was not accidental. And though he could not yet understand its shape or cost, he sensed that the choice to come had already begun to change the course of their lives. The silence that followed the shutting off of the engine felt deliberate, as though the land itself had paused to take note of their arrival. Daniel remained behind the wheel longer than necessary, his hands resting against the worn leather, his eyes fixed on the house ahead. Up close, it seemed even larger than it had from the road, its height exaggerated by the flatness of the surrounding land. The structure did not merely occupy the property, it dominated it, rising out of the tangled growth like something that had refused, stubbornly, to be forgotten. Lauren was the first to open her door. Gravel crunched beneath her shoes as she stepped out, squinting slightly as she took in the full scope of the place. Her posture was stiff, guarded, the same posture she had worn since the trip began. But now there was something else in it as well, a tension that had nothing to do with boredom. Toby climbed out more slowly, staying close to Daniel's side, his small fingers curling into the fabric of his father's jacket as he stared at the house with open curiosity. Daniel stepped out last and shut the car door with a muted thud that seemed too loud in the stillness. The air smelled of damp soil and decaying leaves, rich and heavy, clinging to the back of his throat. Somewhere in the distance, insects droned in a steady rhythm, a sound so constant it faded in and out of awareness. The house itself made no sound at all. They approached along what had once been a driveway, now little more than a narrow path swallowed by weeds and creeping vines. With every step, Daniel became more aware of the sheer neglect surrounding them. The yard bore no sign of recent care, no cut grass or trimmed hedges, only nature reclaiming its space inch by inch. Near the front of the property stood a weathered sign, its lettering faded but still legible enough to communicate its purpose. The house had been officially condemned. The warning felt redundant, as though the building itself had already delivered the message. The porch sagged slightly beneath Daniel's weight as he stepped onto it, the wood groaning in protest. He paused, testing the boards before allowing the children to follow. The front door loomed tall and heavy, its surface scarred by time and exposure. The lock accepted one of the keys after a brief struggle, metal scraping against metal before yielding with a reluctant turn. The door opened inward with a long, drawn-out sound, and the smell hit them immediately. It was the scent of long-closed spaces, of moisture trapped in wood and fabric, of years left to settle without disturbance. Dust hung in the air, catching the light that spilled in from outside and turning it into drifting motes that seemed almost alive. The entryway stretched before them, dim and cavernous. A staircase curved upward along the far wall, its banister coated in a thick layer of dust that dulled the wood's original finish. The ceiling soared higher than Daniel had expected, the space grand in a way that felt out of place given the house's condition. Everything bore the weight of time, but nothing appeared disturbed, as though the house had been sealed off from the world and left to wait. Lauren hesitated at the threshold before stepping inside, her eyes scanning the shadows. Toby stayed close, his grip tightening slightly. Daniel moved forward, forcing himself to breathe evenly, to project calm he did not entirely feel. He told himself that what unsettled him was simply the scale of the place, the sudden confrontation with history made tangible. They moved slowly, exploring room by room, their footsteps echoing softly against the wooden floors. The furniture they encountered was sparse but substantial, pieces that had been built to last, now softened by dust and neglect. Sheets covered chairs and tables in several rooms, yellowed and fragile, sagging under their own weight. In the kitchen, old appliances sat rusted and lifeless, cabinets hanging open as if abandoned mid-task. The light shifted as afternoon wore on, shadows stretching and pooling in corners. Daniel became increasingly aware of how the house seemed to absorb sound. Voices felt muted here, swallowed by the walls before they could fully form. Even the children grew quieter, instinctively lowering their volume as if aware they were intruding on something that preferred stillness. It was not until they began exploring the upper floor that Daniel noticed the first thing he could not immediately explain. As he climbed the stairs, he felt a faint vibration beneath his foot, a subtle shift in the wood that did not correspond to his movement. He paused, listening. There was nothing, only the distant hum of insects outside and the quiet creak of the house settling. He continued upward, dismissing the sensation as imagination. The bedrooms upstairs were smaller, more intimate, their windows coated in grime that filtered the light into a dull glow. One room held a narrow bed frame, its mattress long since decayed. Another contained a dresser with drawers swollen shut from humidity. In the far corner of the hallway, Daniel found a door that resisted his attempt to open it, stuck fast as if it had not been used in years. By the time they returned downstairs, dusk had begun to settle outside, the sky dimming to a muted gray. Daniel realized with a start that they had no practical alternative but to stay the night. The nearest town was miles away, and the drive back through unfamiliar roads in the dark felt unwise. He tried to ignore the unease that followed the thought, focusing instead on logistics. They would stay in the largest ground floor room, keep their belongings close, leave early in the morning. As night fell, the house transformed. Shadows deepened, stretching into unfamiliar shapes. Sounds that had gone unnoticed during the day grew more pronounced. The creak of wood expanding and contracting echoed through the rooms, each sound distinct yet impossible to trace. Daniel lay awake long after the children had settled, his eyes fixed on the ceiling, listening. It was during those quiet hours that the house seemed to assert itself most strongly. Daniel became acutely aware of movement, not visual but sensed, as though the space around him was shifting subtly, responding to his presence. At one point, he thought he heard footsteps above, slow and deliberate, crossing the upper floor. His heart pounded as he strained to listen, but the sound faded before he could be sure of it. Toby stirred beside him, murmuring in his sleep, his face drawn tight with unease. Daniel sat up, placing a steadying hand on his son's shoulder until the tension eased. When he looked toward the hallway, he saw nothing but darkness, yet the feeling of being observed lingered, heavy and insistent. Morning arrived gradually, pale light seeping through grimy windows and revealing the house in a softer state. In daylight, the fear of the night receded, replaced by the practical reality of their surroundings. Dusk lay undisturbed. No doors stood open that had been closed. No evidence remained of anything out of the ordinary. Yet the sense of unease did not leave Daniel. As he moved through the house again, retracing their steps, he felt it watching him, not in a threatening way, but with an attention that felt focused and intent. He could not articulate why, but the impression settled deep in his chest. Lauren noticed his distraction, her own movements careful and alert. Toby remained close, his questions fewer than usual, his eyes tracking shadows that did not quite make sense. The house had made its presence known, not through dramatic displays, but through something subtler and more persistent. It had acknowledged them. Standing in the center of the entryway once more, Daniel looked around with new eyes. This was not simply a neglected structure or an inconvenient inheritance. There was something layered here, something held beneath the surface of peeling paint and warped floors. He did not yet know what it was, but he understood that leaving without answers would be impossible. The house had seen them arrive, and now, whether he wanted it or not, Daniel felt certain that it was waiting for him to notice what it had to show. Morning light did little to soften the presence of the house. It revealed details that darkness had hidden, but it did not lessen the weight Daniel felt as he moved through the rooms again. Dust lay thick on every surface, undisturbed except where their footsteps had marked narrow paths across the floors. The air remained heavy with the smell of age and dampness, as though the walls themselves exhaled slowly, reluctantly, after years of silence. Daniel woke before the children and stood alone in the front room, staring at the staircase that curved upward into shadow. In the daylight, the house looked less threatening, but more complicated. He could see now that its neglect was not uniform. Some sections were decayed beyond repair, yet others showed signs of care long after the rest had been abandoned. Nails that were less corroded than their neighbors, boards that had been replaced at some point and then deliberately concealed. It was as though someone had been maintaining certain parts of the house long after there had been any practical reason to do so. When Lauren and Toby joined him, they ate a quiet breakfast from the supplies Daniel had packed. No one mentioned the night directly, but it lingered between them, unspoken. Lauren's movements were precise and controlled, her gaze sharp as it traveled from doorway to doorway. Toby stayed close, his attention caught by small details Daniel might have overlooked, a faint mark on the wall, a scuff on the floor that seemed out of place. They began exploring again, this time with more intention. Daniel felt a growing need to understand what he was dealing with before making any decisions about the property. The house no longer felt like something he could simply walk away from. Each room seemed to offer hints of something unfinished, something waiting to be recognized. In a narrow hallway near the back of the ground floor, Daniel noticed peeling wallpaper that had curled away from the wall in long, brittle strips. Beneath it, etched directly into the wood, were markings unlike anything he had seen before. They were not decorative in any conventional sense. Circles intersected with straight lines, arrows pointed inward toward central points, and small star-like shapes clustered together in deliberate patterns. The carvings were shallow but precise, their edges smoothed by time. Lauren noticed them at the same moment. She ran her fingers lightly over the symbols, brushing away dust. The markings continued beyond the exposed section, disappearing beneath the remaining wallpaper as though deliberately hidden. Daniel felt a chill settle in his chest. These were not random scratches or idle doodles. Someone had taken time to carve them, then conceal them, as if their presence alone carried weight. They continued searching, and the sense of pattern grew stronger. Similar symbols appeared faintly in other parts of the house, etched into door frames, floorboards, and even the underside of a staircase step. None were immediately obvious. Each required careful observation, the kind of attention someone would only give if they were looking for something specific. In what appeared to have once been a small study, Daniel found a desk pushed against a window clouded with grime. Its drawers were swollen shut, but after several attempts he managed to pry one open. Inside lay a scatter of old papers, receipts, and brittle envelopes, their edges yellowed and fragile. Most were mundane records, supply orders, handwritten notes referencing repairs or deliveries from decades past. At the very bottom, however, lay a single folded sheet wrapped in oil-stained paper. The handwriting was careful and deliberate, the ink faded but legible. It spoke in indirect terms, referencing obligations, safe routes, and trust placed in walls and earth rather than people. The writer never named himself, but the tone carried urgency and restraint, as though the words were meant to endure without drawing attention. Daniel folded the letter and slipped it into his pocket, unsettled by the sense that it had been written not simply to be read, but to be found at the right moment. By late morning, Daniel decided they needed information beyond what the house itself could offer. The name of the nearby town, barely visible on the old map he had brought, suggested a general store or gas station might still exist. He told the children they would drive into town for supplies and perhaps ask a few questions. The town was little more than a crossroads, its buildings spaced far apart and worn by years of exposure. A small general store stood near the edge of the road, its windows filled with sun-faded advertisements. As Daniel stepped inside, the bell above the door rang sharply, cutting through the quiet. Behind the counter stood an elderly woman whose eyes were sharp despite her age. She studied Daniel for a long moment before her expression shifted subtly, recognition flickering across her face. When he introduced himself, her posture straightened slightly. She knew the house. More than that, she knew its history. According to her, the property had belonged to Daniel's great-great-grandfather, a man spoken of in cautious tones even now. In the years before and after the Civil War, he had been involved in activities that were never officially acknowledged, but quietly remembered. The house had served as a refuge, a place of hiding and passage for people seeking safety and freedom. Beneath the property, she said, there were tunnels. Some had collapsed over time, others sealed deliberately. The house had earned a reputation, not for being dangerous, but for being watchful. People said it remembered what had happened within its walls. Those who stayed too long without understanding why the house existed often left unsettled or did not stay at all. Daniel listened carefully, a sense of recognition forming as her words aligned with what he had already seen. She also mentioned that interest in the property had resurfaced recently. Word of its change in ownership had traveled quickly, and not everyone who paid attention did so out of historical curiosity. There were those who believed the house hid valuables, tangible rewards buried alongside its stories. When Daniel returned to the car, his thoughts were heavy. The drive back to the property felt shorter, the road more familiar now that its destination carried meaning. As the house came back into view, he noticed something that had not been there before. Fresh tire tracks cut through the overgrown grass near the edge of the property, their impression deep enough to suggest recent passage. The sight sent a quiet warning through him. Someone else had been there, or was planning to be. Inside, the house felt different. The silence was denser, charged with an awareness Daniel could not shake. He moved through the rooms with renewed focus, drawn repeatedly back toward the study and the markings on the walls. The house no longer seemed like a passive structure. It felt active, layered with intention. As evening approached, Daniel realized that whatever secrets the house held were not meant to remain buried. The symbols, the letters, the stories whispered by the town's lone witness all pointed in the same direction. Beneath the floors and behind the walls lay answers that could not be ignored. And now, with the knowledge that others might seek those answers for their own reasons, Daniel understood that time was no longer on his side. The traces of the past were no longer just remnants. They were signals, guiding him deeper into the house's history, whether he was ready for it or not. The knowledge Daniel carried back from town settled over the house like a second skin. What had once felt like vague unease now sharpened into purpose. The stories he had heard, combined with the markings carved into the walls and the letter hidden in the desk, formed a pattern he could no longer ignore. The house was not simply old. It was designed to conceal, to protect, and to endure long after its builders were gone. As dusk approached, Daniel moved through the rooms with a new kind of attention. Every creak beneath his feet, every uneven board or oddly placed rug seemed suddenly significant. Lauren watched him closely, her skepticism giving way to something more cautious and alert. Toby followed behind them, quiet but intent, as though he sensed that the house was beginning to reveal itself in ways words could not yet capture. They returned to the study, where the air felt heavier than elsewhere. The symbols carved beneath the wallpaper seemed almost to draw Daniel's eyes back to them again and again. He examined the floor carefully, noting how the boards near the desk were slightly misaligned, their edges worn differently than the rest. When he pressed down with his foot, there was the faintest give, subtle but unmistakable. He crouched and pulled back the thin, faded rug that lay partially beneath the desk. Beneath it, set flush into the floor, was a square metal hatch. Its surface was rusted but intact, framed by iron bolts that had been driven deep into the surrounding wood. A corroded padlock held it shut, its presence both ordinary and ominous. For a long moment, none of them spoke. The house seemed to lean inward, as though listening. Daniel ran his fingers over the lock, feeling its cold resistance. He did not yet have the tools to open it, but its existence alone confirmed everything he had begun to suspect. Whatever had been hidden here was not an afterthought. It had been built into the very bones of the house. That night sleep came fitfully. Daniel lay awake, replaying the day's discoveries in his mind. The sounds of the house were louder now, or perhaps he was simply more attuned to them. Wood shifted somewhere above. A soft thud echoed from within the walls. At times he thought he heard movement, slow and deliberate, as though someone were walking just out of sight. In the early hours before dawn, he woke abruptly, his heart pounding. The air felt colder, sharper against his skin. From the direction of the study came a faint sound, a scraping noise followed by something like a sigh. He sat up, listening, but the sound faded, leaving only silence behind. Morning brought no clarity, only urgency. Daniel knew he could not delay any longer. Whatever lay beneath the house was drawing closer to the surface, whether through his actions or its own insistence. He decided they would investigate the hatch as soon as possible. Before he could act, however, Toby approached him, his face pale but composed in a way that unsettled Daniel more than fear would have. The boy spoke of dreams, of a presence that guided him rather than frightened him. He described passages and doors, places where the house seemed to open itself willingly. Daniel listened carefully, struck by how closely his son's words mirrored the impressions he himself had been struggling to articulate. Lauren, too, seemed changed. Though she said little, her resistance softened into resolve. She no longer questioned why they stayed. She understood, perhaps instinctively, that leaving now would mean abandoning something unfinished. They began clearing the study, moving books and furniture away from the walls. As they worked, Daniel noticed a section of shelving that did not quite match the rest. The wood was newer, the nails less rusted, the base slightly misaligned. When he pressed against it, the shelf shifted. Together, he and Lauren pushed, and with a low groan that echoed through the room, the entire bookshelf swung outward on hidden hinges. Behind it lay a narrow passage, its entrance masked perfectly when the shelf was closed. Cold air spilled out, carrying the smell of earth and damp stone. Daniel retrieved a flashlight and stepped inside first. The passage sloped downward, its brick walls slick with moisture. Roots pushed through in places, their pale tendrils curling into the space like reaching fingers. The sound of their footsteps echoed unnaturally, amplified by the confined space. The passage opened into a small chamber reinforced with thick beams. At its center stood a rough wooden table covered in dust. On it lay maps marked with faded ink, bundles of letters sealed with wax long since cracked, and objects whose purpose was not immediately clear. Along one wall hung a series of medallions engraved with names and dates, each one a quiet testament to someone who had passed through this hidden space. Daniel understood then that this was not merely a hiding place. It was a record, a sanctuary designed not only to protect bodies, but to preserve memory. In a corner of the chamber sat a trunk, its lid warped but intact. Inside were folded blankets, tin cups, and a leather-bound ledger. When Daniel opened it, the pages revealed names written in careful script, each entry accompanied by symbols matching those carved into the house above. Dates marked arrivals and departures, tracing a path of lives intersecting briefly with this place before moving on. The weight of it settled heavily in Daniel's chest. These were not myths or rumors. This was evidence of a deliberate network, a quiet resistance carried out at great risk. When they returned to the house above, the silence felt altered. The oppressive tension that had filled the rooms seemed to have eased, replaced by something watchful but restrained. Yet the sense of being alone did not return. The house still felt aware, as though acknowledging their progress while withholding its deepest secrets. That night, the sounds returned, with renewed intensity. Doors shifted softly on their hinges. Footsteps echoed through hallways no one occupied. But this time, the disturbances felt less threatening, more insistent, as though urging Daniel onward. The following morning brought a new concern. Daniel noticed fresh tire tracks near the property once again, closer than before. Someone was watching. Someone was waiting. He understood now that the hidden chamber they had found was only the beginning. The maps, the ledger, the symbols all suggested something deeper, something sealed away more deliberately. The house had not revealed everything. It had shown him enough to prove that what lay beneath was worth protecting and worth uncovering. As Daniel stood once more in the study, his gaze drawn inexorably back to the hatch in the floor, he felt the convergence of past and present pressing in around him. The house had entrusted him with its first secret. It was clear that it expected him to uncover the rest. The night after the discovery of the hidden chamber passed without rest. Daniel lay awake on the floor of the front room, staring up at the darkened ceiling while the house breathed around him. The sounds were no longer random creaks and settling boards. They had rhythm now, a pattern he could almost follow if he let himself focus too closely. Somewhere deep within the walls, something seemed to shift and pause, as though waiting for him to act. By morning, the sense of urgency had hardened into certainty. Daniel knew that the chamber behind the bookshelf was not the end of what the house concealed. Too many signs pointed further downward. The ledger, the maps, the recurring symbols, all suggested layers of protection built one atop another, each designed to be discovered only after the last had been understood. Whatever lay beyond had been sealed not simply to hide it, but to ensure it would not be found by chance or by greed. Lauren noticed the change in him almost immediately. He moved with intention now, no longer circling the house in hesitant exploration. Toby, too, seemed different, quieter but more focused, as though the house had become familiar to him in ways Daniel could not explain. The boy lingered near the study, his attention drawn again and again to the floor beneath the rug. Before anything else, Daniel drove back into town. He told himself it was practical, that he needed tools, but he knew it was more than that. The lock on the hatch had become a presence in his thoughts, a barrier both physical and symbolic. He borrowed what he needed from a man who asked no questions, but watched him with thinly veiled concern. The house's reputation had traveled far enough that explanation was unnecessary. When Daniel returned, the air around the property felt taut, as though the land itself sensed what was coming. He carried the tools inside and set them beside the hatch. Lauren stood nearby, arms folded tightly, her expression pale but resolved. Toby hovered just behind her, clutching a small flashlight as if it were a talisman. The lock resisted at first, metal protesting against metal with sharp, echoing sounds that seemed far too loud in the stillness of the house. When it finally gave way, snapping open with a brittle crack, the sound rang through the study and down the halls beyond. Daniel froze, listening, half expecting an answer. None came, only silence, thick and expectant. He grasped the iron ring set into the hatch and pulled. The wood groaned, then tore free with sudden force, swinging upward and releasing a rush of air so cold it stole his breath. The smell that rose from below was ancient, layered with damp earth and something sharper, metallic, that clung to the back of his throat. Beneath the hatch lay a steep staircase descending into darkness. The steps were narrow but solid, worn smooth by use long ago. A frayed rope ran along one side, anchored into the stone wall, offering the only support. Daniel shone his flashlight downward, its beam swallowed quickly by the curve of the passage. He hesitated only long enough to give the children instructions, then began his descent. The temperature dropped with every step. The walls closed in, carved stone replacing brick, the symbols appearing again, etched deeply into the surface as though meant to endure centuries. Lauren followed close behind, her light trembling slightly despite her effort to keep it steady. The passage opened into a wide chamber that stole Daniel's breath. It was far larger than anything they had seen before, stretching outward beneath the house in a deliberate, carefully planned space. Wooden shelves lined the walls, stacked with crates, jars, tools, and supplies, preserved long past their usefulness. Everything had been arranged with purpose, labeled and stored as though waiting for return. At the far end of the chamber stood an iron door half buried beneath fallen debris. It bore no handle, only a circular indentation at its center, ringed with the same symbols Daniel had seen throughout the house. The metal radiated cold, an unnatural chill that seemed to leach warmth from the air around it. Before approaching the door, Daniel noticed a table set near the center of the room. Upon it lay a leather-bound journal, its clasp intact. When he opened it, the writing inside was precise and careful, a continuation of the voice he had glimpsed in the earlier letter. The entries spoke of roots and shelters, of names recorded not for ownership but for remembrance. Toward the end, the tone shifted, growing urgent and fragmented. References appeared to a second vault, sealed until blood returned, until the right hand stood before the door. The realization settled heavily on Daniel. The house had not simply recognized them, it had been waiting for them. The sound came then, faint but unmistakable. Footsteps echoed down the passage behind them, slow and deliberate, not matching their own. Lauren's light jerked toward the darkness, catching nothing but stone and shadow. The sound grew closer, and panic surged through Daniel despite his effort to remain calm. He grabbed Lauren's arm and pulled her back toward the stairs. They ran, their footsteps loud and frantic, the sound behind them multiplying until it seemed to fill the tunnel. When they reached the hatch, Daniel shoved it shut with all his strength, the wood slamming into place just as the noise reached its peak. The house fell silent once more. Back in the study, Daniel leaned against the wall, his chest heaving. Toby stood frozen, eyes wide but not frightened. He said only that the house had not wanted them to open the door yet, that it was not time. That night, Daniel read the journal again by lantern light. The pieces came together slowly, forming a picture too deliberate to ignore. The iron door was not a barrier to treasure in the traditional sense. It was a final safeguard, protecting something meant to be returned, not claimed. The symbols were instructions. The house itself was a mechanism, guiding those who could understand it while repelling those who could not. Outside, a truck engine growled briefly in the distance before fading away. Daniel knew then that others were watching, drawn by rumor and impatience. Whatever lay behind the iron door would not remain hidden forever. As dawn approached, Daniel closed the journal and looked toward the hatch in the floor. The fear he felt was no longer for himself. It was for what might happen if the house's purpose was misunderstood. What had been preserved beneath it was fragile, not because it lacked value, but because its value could so easily be corrupted. He understood now that the final choice had not yet been made. The house had shown him what it protected. Soon it would demand that he decide what to do with it. By the time morning arrived, Daniel felt as though he had aged years in a single night. The thin gray light filtering through the grimy windows did little to chase away the weight that had settled over him. The house was quiet in a way it had not been before. Not empty or indifferent, but restrained, as if holding itself still. He sat at the large table in the library, the leather-bound journal open before him, its pages spread like a map of obligations he could no longer pretend were theoretical. Lauren emerged from the hallway first, her steps slow and careful. She studied her father's face for a moment before looking away, her gaze drifting toward the floor where the hatch lay hidden beneath the rug. She did not ask questions. She did not need to. Whatever they had crossed together over the past days had carried them beyond denial. Toby followed soon after, quiet and watchful, his presence grounding Daniel in a way nothing else could. They ate breakfast in near silence, the scrape of utensils sounding louder than it should have. Outside, the property looked unchanged, the same wild growth pressing in from all sides. But Daniel knew better now. The house was not isolated. It was connected to everything that had passed through it, and to everything that might yet return. Daniel spent the morning sorting through the documents they had already uncovered, laying them out carefully on the table. The names in the ledger repeated themselves across different records. Some appeared alongside dates and destinations, others alongside brief notes written in a tight, disciplined hand. These were not random entries. They were accounts carefully maintained over years, each one representing a life entrusted to this place. He realized then that what lay beneath the iron door was not simply hidden out of caution, but sealed with intention. The house was meant to keep its secret until someone could understand it fully. The decision took shape quietly, not as a sudden revelation, but as a gradual alignment of thought and feeling. Daniel understood that claiming the house as property in the conventional sense would miss its point entirely. He could sell it, strip it of whatever value remained, and walk away with enough money to ease his immediate problems. The thought crossed his mind, and he did not pretend otherwise. But it faded quickly, hollow and insufficient. The house had never been about profit. It was about completion. Lauren watched him as he worked, her skepticism replaced by a steadier resolve. She began organizing the photographs they had found, lining them up carefully, matching faces to names where possible. Toby helped in his own way, carrying papers from one pile to another, his small hands treating each item with surprising care. The house seemed to respond to their focus. The air felt lighter, the oppressive tension receding in subtle ways Daniel could feel, but not yet explain. By early afternoon, Daniel noticed movement near the edge of the property. A truck idled on the road beyond the trees, its presence unmistakable. He watched from the window as it lingered, then slowly pulled away. He knew this was not the end of it. Interest in the house would not vanish overnight, but he also knew something else now. The house had already proven it would not yield easily to those who approached it with the wrong intentions. That knowledge steadied him. As the sun dipped lower, Daniel returned to the hatch one final time. This time, there was no fear in the act. He opened it deliberately, lantern in hand, and descended into the chamber below. The cold air wrapped around him, familiar now rather than hostile. The iron door waited at the far end, unchanged, its surface dull and unyielding. He did not try to open it. Instead, he knelt before it, lantern light casting long shadows across the stone. He placed the journal on the ground and rested his hand against the cold metal. He did not speak aloud, but the intention was clear. He understood what the house required of him. The iron door would open when the time was right, not because it was forced, but because its purpose had been accepted. When he returned upstairs, the house felt different, not silent, but settled. The subtle sense of being watched had transformed into something quieter, more distant, as though the house no longer needed to hold its breath. That night, when Daniel finally lay down to sleep, he heard the whispers again. This time, they were not fragmented or unsettling. They carried a steady cadence, a low murmur that felt less like voices and more like acknowledgement. Over the following days, Daniel began making plans. He contacted historical societies, legal aid organizations, and archivists who specialized in tracing lineage and property records. Each call carried weight, not because the task ahead was easy, but because it was necessary. He knew it would take time, perhaps years, to track down every descendant connected to the names preserved beneath the house. But the scope of the task did not deter him. It grounded him. Lauren, too, found purpose in the work. She documented everything meticulously, photographing documents and organizing digital records. Toby listened, absorbing the gravity of what they were doing without fully understanding it, yet sensing its importance all the same. The house, once a source of unease, became a place of quiet focus. The outside threats faded gradually. The truck did not return. Word spread, though Daniel did not know how, that the house was no longer a prize to be claimed. Its value lay in stories and responsibilities few were willing to shoulder. Those who had been drawn by rumors of hidden wealth lost interest when it became clear there was no easy reward. As weeks passed, the house continued to change, Doors no longer shifted on their own. Footsteps no longer echoed through empty halls. The air grew warmer, more stable, as though the structure itself were easing into rest. Daniel felt it most clearly one evening as he stood on the porch, watching the sun sink behind the trees. For the first time since arriving, he felt no urgency to leave, no pressure to escape what he had inherited. He thought often of his life before the letter arrived, of the narrowness that had defined his days. The problems had not vanished. Bills still needed paying. The future remained uncertain. But the weight he carried now was different. It was not the weight of failure or regret. It was the weight of stewardship. Late one night, long after the children had gone to sleep, Daniel returned to the library. He stood in the center of the room, listening to the quiet. Somewhere deep within the house, he sensed a presence. No longer restless, no longer demanding. The house had waited for decades, perhaps longer. It had been patient. Now it was content to let him work. Daniel understood then that the inheritance had never been about land or structure. It had been about continuity, about ensuring that what had been done in secrecy and risk did not vanish into obscurity. The house had held its vigil until someone was willing to see it not as a burden, but as a promise. As he extinguished the lantern and climbed the stairs, Daniel felt something settle within him that he had not felt in years, a quiet certainty. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he would meet them with clarity. The house had given him more than a task. It had given him direction. And in the deep stillness of the night, with his children sleeping safely under its roof, the old house finally rested, its long watch over, its legacy no longer hidden, but carried forward. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next one. We have many more stories like this waiting for you, filled with mystery, history, and unforgettable characters. Check out our other videos and continue the journey with us. And if this story moved you, share it with your friends. It really helps the channel grow and lets more people discover these stories.